Hello and welcome to this month's Rights in Russia interview. Today, our guest is Anna Bowles from the UK, a freelance editor who holds an MA in Russian Studies from the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. She's also a writer who recently published a novel for young adults about a girl with bipolar disorder. In late March to April of this year, she spent 2 weeks in East and South Ukraine with her friends from the Freefilmers NGO, interviewing local people, especially women in rural communities, about their experiences and survival strategies. Anna blogged regularly about her trip, and the blog fundraiser supports the people she met. Thanks for being on Rights in Russia, Anna, and for giving us a sense of your Ukraine visit and helping us better understand what is happening there.
Thanks for inviting me.
Good. So what sparked your interest in Ukraine in the beginning?
Well, as you say, I have an MA in Russian Studies, so I have a long-term interest in that part of the world. But I also have a close friend who lives in Kiev, a Ukrainian, who I've known for a few years. And we talked a lot online during lockdown. And afterwards, I went to visit her in December 2021. So that was not long before the outbreak of the war. We actually had a plan for me to come back in the spring, and we would drive down through Ukraine and hang out with her friends in Mariupol, which of course didn't end up happening. But Yulia is part of this Freefilmers network. Originally, they were filmmakers, as you might guess. And we were going to stay with Sashko in Mariupol, and he's basically the hub of Freefilmers. He transformed Freefilmers into an NGO helping people in South and East Ukraine. He moved to Zaporizhia himself and started doing all sorts of volunteer work. I'll talk about that a bit more later. But that's how I ended up getting so enmeshed, because we were going to go and visit Sashko, and it eventually happened, just in a very different way to what we expected.
Right. So then what motivated you to go at this particular time? Right. Was this the time that you were going to go visit Sashko, right?
We intended to visit Sashko in March 2022, so that was not all.
So that was a year ago.
Yeah. Instead, I went to visit Yulia in Kiev during summer last year, June, July, which was a few months after the start of the war, and that was essentially a friendly visit, and also curiosity on my part to see what life was like in Ukraine at the moment. But also because I am a writer, I hope that I would be able to bring back my story of being there and help connect people in the UK with what was going on in Ukraine. So I went there for a week to see Yulia, and I just wrote up a blog about it, and Simon kindly did some coverage of that on Rights in Russia. And previously I had been to Kiev twice, but before my trip a few weeks ago, I hadn't been outside the capital.
How difficult is it to go back and forth to Ukraine like that?
It's not very difficult, it just takes time. Fortunately, I have the kind of job where I can be a digital nomad when I want to. So I actually had to spend 3 nights away from home just getting to Zaporizhia. I had to stay in an airport hotel in the UK and then a hotel in Slovakia, and then spend a night on the train from Slovakia to Zaporizhia. But because I can work on my laptop, I can do that without losing any income. So it's just a case of patience, and you will get there.
So on this particular trip, can you tell us a little bit about where you went and what your itinerary was?
Yes, the plan originally was for me to spend 2 weeks in Zaporizhia. In practice, that ended up being about 11 days in Zaporizhia and 2 days in Kiev. I'll go into a bit more detail about what I did there. But in Zaporizhia, we spent some time in and around the city and some time on 2 big expeditions. So what we were doing is part of the Freefilmers' usual work, which is distributing necessary items to various places. So around Zaporizhia itself, we visited an NGO called Yes, who help IDPs. Freefilmers is a very, very small organization. Yes is a larger one, and Yes has a huge database of IDPs' contact details.
Wow.
But Freefilmers were able to get hold of a lot of hard to find but discounted medication. So we work with NGO Yes to obtain the medicine on our side and then take it to them and distribute the medicine to people who they called in from their database. So that was one of the things that we did within Zaporizhia. And Freefilmers are also approached by individuals sometimes from places further outside. So we went out to some of the villages in the vicinity of Zaporizhia, and for example, we gave about £375 in the equivalent of local currency to a woman whose child has just been diagnosed with hearing impairment to buy her a special hearing device. As basic medical care in Ukraine is pretty good, but it goes this far and no further. If you want a certain level of care, then you do need to pay. So we identified a need there, and we were able to fill it with some of the money that is being donated to my fundraiser. So that was in and around Zaporizhia itself.
Could I ask you, where is Zaporizhia, for those of us who are not familiar with it? In what part of Ukraine is it?
Zaporizhia is in the southeast, and most people probably know by now that Mariupol is on the south coast, and that there is a lot of fighting ongoing in East Ukraine. And Zaporizhia is kind of down in the corner between the two, but in territory that has never been conquered by the Russians. It's only about 30 kilometers from the front line, but that front line has been stable since the beginning of the invasion. And there is very little chance that the Russians can approach Zaporizhia because they don't seem to be able to achieve very much. So it's somewhere that you might think was dangerous, but isn't actually in practice.
Okay, so then after you finished in Zaporizhia, you went on?
Yes, using Zaporizhia as a base, we went to a couple of other places. So we did two big expeditions, one of which was to a village in the vicinity of Kharkiv. And Kharkiv is up in the northeast of the country. It's very close to the border with Russia. It's just about 20 kilometers from the border with Russia, in fact. Kharkiv itself is Ukraine's second city, and the fighting got very close to Kharkiv, but it didn't actually make it inside the city. But some of the villages in the vicinity of Kharkiv were on the front line for 6 months, so they changed hands multiple times. They got hammered, essentially. So we visited a village called Mospanova, where we were shown around by one of the people involved in the leadership of the village. And it's a very poor place. They didn't have very much before the Russians came and obliterated what they did have. So we took some very practical items to them. We took spades, rakes, secateurs, saucepans, other kitchen equipment, just the kind of really basic things that people actually don't have anymore because the Russian army stole or destroyed it all, but that will be really effective in their hands. So we literally went to Epicenter, which is Ukrainian B&Q, one day, bought a dozen spades, a dozen rakes, and a dozen secateurs, and next day took them to this village. And a decent spade in Ukraine costs about £6. So we were able to get a lot of really useful items to this village for not a great deal of difficulty and expenditure. And of course, these mean a huge deal to the locals, because if you've got a spade, you can dig your garden and grow food, which you can't do without the spade. So it really felt like we were doing something useful and making an impact by doing that. And then we stayed in Kharkiv city overnight.
Now you mentioned that you're actually pretty close to the fighting. So I'd like to know, I mean, if you felt you were in danger, any of the places that you went, and secondly, though, how you decide where to go based on how dangerous it is.
I didn't really feel in danger. Zaporizhia was hit once by rockets when I was there, and we retreated to the corridor for about half an hour. Obviously, Ukrainians are very experienced in what it sounds like when your city is hit and what you should do about it. And I was advised that if you hear a hit in the distance, well, you can't do anything about it. But if a car alarm goes off, then that means that fragments have been sprayed in the vicinity, and it's a good idea to retreat to the corridor. So I did have to spend half an hour hiding in the corridor, and I did hear a couple of impacts, but nothing worse than that. And of course, there's the air alert sirens. They go off up to 7 times a day in Zaporizhia. So people just ignore them because you couldn't live your life if you went running for the shelter every time there was a siren. So you just get used to that very quickly. And there is a lot in the news about Zaporizhia being struck quite often, which it is, but it's absolutely true that places like Mariupol have been completely devastated. There is no element of exaggeration there, but Zaporizhia is a big place, so it's not very likely that you personally will be affected by any particular rocket strike, as long as the Russians keep up their current level of assault, which is not comparable to what they are doing to the cities in the east.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'd like to hear a little more about the Freefilmers. I mean, are they? I mean, you've talked about some of the activities that you were engaged in, charitable activities, getting medical supplies or agricultural supplies. But is the filmers in their name? Do they also video what they're doing, and do they make those videos available?
We don't video the kind of work I've just talked about, because we're very keen to avoid a situation where people feel that they have to perform in order to be given what they need, for example. So that's always the dilemma with any kind of charitable work, really. You want to make sure that people feel that they can receive what you're giving them without any obligation. But members of the network do continue with their projects. Sashko, who is the guy I was just talking about as being the coordinator and the guy I was staying with, he escaped from Mariupol on one of the last trains out of the city, but he has some friends who risked their lives driving backwards and forwards to Mariupol to rescue people. So he made a short film called My Favorite Job, which I can give you links to, which is about his friends who did that. And of course, that's a fascinating story. But that is about his friends. So it's kind of on an equal level. It's not about going to the village of poor people and videoing the village of poor people in return for giving them things. You see the difference.
Right. So in the places that you're visiting, what are your main impressions of how people are dealing with the war there?
Well, I mentioned Mospanova, which is the poorest place we went to, and that was the place where people were most obviously still suffering. We met one lady who she had lost both her son and her husband in the shelling last year, and it was actually the 1 year anniversary of her son's death. So, of course, after a while, she just started crying. And then she took us into her kitchen and gave us a lovely memorial cake that she had baked, which apparently is part of the tradition, that you bake a cake and you eat nice food and you sit there and remember the person who you've lost. So that was an honour, obviously. And we gave her a blood pressure cuff and a headlamp, because there's no electricity there, so you need a headlamp to not fall down the steps in the dark. And a spade. So it's not going to compensate for the loss of your son and your husband, but obviously she was glad to receive these things because they make her life a little bit better. And elsewhere in the village, we met the village headman, who was great. He was absolutely delighted that we were distributing spades, because quite often what happens is that large aid agencies will distribute substantial building materials. So if your roof has been bombed in, they will give you some roof beams. But beyond that, it's quite difficult to obtain the smaller, more practical things. So if someone turns up with hammers, for example, then that's actually really useful filling the gaps. So that's one of the things we want to do next. We took a lot of gardening equipment and kitchen equipment, but some of the places we visited, we want to now take building equipment, because that is obviously a need. Most people are coping in one way or another, as you might expect. There's a bit of selection bias there, because we were talking to the people who were coping by definition. We went into the houses of some elderly people who were being cared for, who were obviously near the end of their lives, and some of them didn't quite understand what was going on. So we just left them with whatever we were donating and moved on and hoped that we'd done what we can. We also went to a community in the north of Kherson Oblast, which was occupied for about 6 months, and it wasn't fought over quite as much as Mospanova, I don't think, but it had to deal with more of the Russian army living in the place and terrorizing everyone. So there was some difficult personal stories there. We spoke to a guy who used to own 2 shops in the town, which I think made him the local big businessman, and a pigeon farm. And since the occupation, he seems to have transformed himself into a genuine community leader. So he was overseeing some of the ongoing projects to rebuild and try to help people in whatever way. We also talked to local people of different kinds. We were delivering some bicycles, and one of those, for example, was for the district nurse, who is working madly to try and get around everybody who needs help in this large sprawling village. And so she was delighted to receive a bicycle, because that will be helpful. We met 2 children there, which is quite unusual, because a lot of children have left for obvious reasons. And they were doing a little better than they had been recently, because they are now using the local military Starlink connection for education. So education is a very big deal. It has to be done online, and you can only do it if you've got a connection. But we were able to take donated tablets to these 2 boys, and thanks to the military, they've got the internet. So in certain places, education is currently impossible in Ukraine, but we encountered people who were doing their best to make the education system work in some way, be it teachers or the children participating in the system. So there is a great deal of will to get back to normal as far as possible. But at the same time, on the same day that we visited this community and handed out tablets and spoke to the guy who was trying to get the reconstruction going, they were holding a funeral for a guy who had been blown up while working in the fields. He'd come across a mine. So he was killed, and another guy lost his feet, apparently. So we didn't see that, but that was something going on at exactly the same time. So people are doing their best to rebuild their lives, but under very, very difficult circumstances, because just going out with your spade to dig the potatoes, which I've just spoken of being a good thing, could get you killed by a mine.
And are mines a big problem in most places where the Russian army has been?
Yes, they are a huge problem. While we were in Arkhangelsk, we heard a detonation and saw a plume of black smoke. That was controlled demining, but mines are pretty much everywhere the Russians retreated, because they just left as many as possible. And there's something that I'm not sure what the official name is, but the Ukrainians call them petals. And these are mines that are dropped from overhead. They just fall anywhere, even in trees. So you could walk under a tree and a mine might fall on your head. It's almost impossible to find those mines. And when we were in Kharkiv Oblast, there were a lot of red poles by the side of the road indicating that this is probably mined. And when you run out of red poles, which happens quite quickly, I think, due to the amount of red poles you need, people just tie bits of cloth to the bushes, white ones if they can get them, or any other. So you go for miles and miles with these red poles and bits of cloth. And also in Kharkiv Oblast, they were burning the fields clear, which is partly a way of preparing them to be sown again, but it also shows the mines up. So it's a huge problem, and it won't be fixed anytime soon because there's just such a large area. And that's one of the reasons Mospanova doesn't have any electricity at the moment, because they have fixed the pylons within the village. But in order to get the electricity to those pylons, the infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. And of course, there's mines all around the village. So they can't rebuild the electricity until the mines are out of the way. But they are probably not a priority in that area because it's just a little village.
Right. So it's spring, but so this is the time when people are going out in the fields. I mean, if there's going to be a harvest, they need to start planning now. Is that right?
Yes, I think some farmers are doing DIY demining, and probably some of them are getting blown up while doing that DIY demining. So I'm aware that there are certain charities and operations working for that. And we did see a lot of planted fields as we travelled around. So farmers are managing to plant a harvest.
Right.
But it is coming at a great human cost of people just wandering into a wood and a mine falls on their heads.
Right. You mentioned the two boys in the village that were working remotely on their lessons. You have written a novel about a teenager in the UK, and so I'm wondering what you can say about the other young people that you met in Ukraine, and as on a kind of a comparison basis. I mean, how like their counterparts in the UK are these young people?
We didn't meet that many children, as I say, because so many of them have left the country.
Right.
But it was noticeable, I suppose, that these two boys behaved in one way that was very much like British children, and in another way which wasn't. So when we first handed over the tablets, they were delighted and ran around videoing each other, absolutely, as kids would do. But then one of them, once he got over the initial excitement, he just folded the cover over it and clasped it to his chest. And then he wandered around for the next hour with this clasped to his chest. So you can tell from that how important this device was to him. He was playing with it like a kid, but it was also something precious, in a way that no British child is likely to treat a digital artifact, because we have so many of them.
Exactly.
When it comes to older children, teenagers, I did meet quite a few teenagers, including some who are part of Petichka Fund, which is an organisation related to Freefilmers. And these are all from Mariupol or the occupied territories, and there's quite a dramatic story behind them. Sashko, I've mentioned. One of his friends is called Maria, and she used to work in Mariupol doing art therapy for teenagers. And she left Mariupol very early on in the invasion. But of course, the teenagers she worked with were scattered everywhere. Some of them had to stay in Mariupol. Some of them were taken to Russia. A few of them made it out into Kiev. But quite often they had pro-Russian parents who were obstructive. So back at the start of the war, or a couple of months in, some of these teenagers were non-consensually living, if you can put it that way, in different places. One of them ended up in an orphanage in the Russian Federation, and others were living with parents in the DPR who just didn't want to let them move. So the big challenge initially for Petichka Fund was to retrieve these children. And the children were very keen to be retrieved, but their parents would not cooperate. And in one case, the child had essentially been abducted to an orphanage. So by means that we do not specify, they were extracted from Russia and the DPR. And for a while, that was a clandestine operation. But now they are safely back in Ukraine. And we are working on the next stage, which is to ensure that they can all live independently and support themselves psychologically as well. So the current job for Petichka Fund is to fund job training and psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. So that's the stage we're at there. And I met some of these teenagers when I went up to Kiev, because my friend Maria, who I've just spoken of as coordinating Petichka Fund, was living in Kiev, although she has just moved. And the teenagers are mostly living in Kiev. So we all met up and had a Zamotka party. A Zamotka is a kind of wrap that was invented in Mariupol. And it's an artistic wrap. You have to arrange your food in an artistically pleasing fashion on this wrap and then fold it up. And I was dreadful at this, but I gamely attempted to do so. It was just great to finally meet these teenagers who I'd been trying to help my friend to extract from Russia, and see that they were all together, all living in Kiev and trying to build their lives. But of course, building their lives is difficult. They are often traumatized, as you might expect. For example, one of the girls that we have helped not extract from Russia, but who is also part of the system, is from Mariupol, and her father was taken captive on the first day of the invasion. He's a border guard and hasn't been heard of since. And she's living in a room with her mother and her brother. So Petichka Fund and Freefilmers were able to provide her with a laptop, so she can kind of disappear into her little world, even though she's stuck in a room with her mother and brother. And also she can study design, which is what she wants to do for a living. So there's all sorts of different ways that we've managed to help young people, which is obviously very rewarding, and we will continue to do so.
So before the war, there was so much interaction between Ukraine and Russia. And I'm wondering, how did you get a sense of how people feel about the Russian people in Ukraine right now? And
yes,
whether did they opinions vary?
Opinions vary, as yes. But there are some intensely negative opinions, as you might say. I mean, the most extreme manifestation of that I met was a female soldier who I interviewed, and she just said, "I want to kill Russians." She was born in the town of Avdiivka, which was overrun in the first invasion in 2014. And then she moved to Mariupol. So she's 29 years old, and she's had her life destroyed twice by Russia. So it's difficult to digest, but it's understandable why her attitude to Russians is, "I want to kill them." At the other end of the scale, people, I think, best way to put it, nobody thinks Russia is wonderful, or nobody who I've met. There are some people who still believe in the Russian world, but there is a big gulf in Ukrainian society between people who have swallowed the Kool-Aid, is the phrase I've heard of that. And it's generational, I'm told. There are people who remember the Soviet Union and enjoyed the stability and security that it gave, who now regard that as the old days and support Russia because of that. But there are very few younger people who have a positive opinion of Russia, certainly in Free Ukraine. So the most positive opinion that I met in Free Ukraine was someone saying, "Yes, we will talk to Russians, but not if they go on about how wonderful the Russian world is." So they're happy to talk to Russians on practical matters, but they don't want to be told about Tolstoy.
Got it. So you've been blogging about your trip, and if you had to summarize the main message you'd like to send to the world about it, kind of what would it be?
I think there are a couple of main messages. The one from the Ukrainians that I got most forcefully relates to our last point, really. They all said that the West should not be scared to fund their army. That doesn't just mean government. That means that Western civilian populations should accept the need to fund the army, as well as sending teddy bears and coffee and socks and other things. It's all useful, but without the weapons, then Ukraine can't win the war and protect the children to whom the teddy bears are being given. So that's a message I'm conveying from the Ukrainians. Yeah, the feeling I got myself, and that I would hope to share with other people, is the immediacy of it all and the extent to which we can actually have an effect. So Ukraine is 1,000 miles away from the UK and even further from the US, obviously, but the world is connected now, and what you see on your screen isn't just on your screen, it's something that's within your reach. So I have been collecting money for Ukraine for a year, and as a result of this, kids have been rescued from abduction to the Russian Federation, and people are able to feed themselves because we have driven around in a van handing out spades. And this is a very direct, concrete result of people sending me money. So if you donate to Ukraine, if you pick the right direction, then you are not sending your money into a black hole to be unsure what will happen to it. It will be really well spent, and it's worth continuing to do so.
And all this information is on your blog, is that right?
Yes, yes. The blog is quite substantial, so I recommend clearing a couple of hours, sitting down with a cup of coffee and engaging with this blog. That's quite a substantial ask these days. I know not very many people have a couple of hours to do that. But part of my aim in writing it has been to actually document what my friends are doing. It's not just a fundraiser. It is a snapshot documentary of what life is like in East and South Ukraine at the moment, because I was able to talk to a lot of people who would not necessarily talk to journalists, because I was there as an activist and a friend of Ukrainians. So while journalists often have an agenda, and even if they try not to, they have to fit what they write into a certain set of criteria and length and format, I didn't have to do that. So what I've done with this blog is take different approaches post by post. So some posts are discussions, some are interviews with quotes, some are humorous. I had a trip mascot. The trip mascot is very cute. And the whole blog, I hope, should be a reading experience like a book at this point. And you will come away from it with a deeper understanding than you would get from reading an equal amount of standard journalistic coverage.
And how about your plans? Do you plan to go back?
I certainly plan to go back if there is a good reason to do so. We have raised about £2,000 so far, which is great. That's more than I would have been able to donate myself during a 2-week period. Obviously, I hope to receive more money, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing interviews. That's how it works. Yes, I hope to go back given an opportunity. It was very rewarding for me personally, obviously, to see the results of what I've been trying to achieve by collecting money here and trying to also provide some emotional support for friends over there. It was particularly interesting to visit small villages, which is not somewhere as a Westerner I would normally get access to. And I do feel that I was doing something useful by creating this record of life in the area that people obviously consider valuable. in part for future reasons as well as current ones, because obviously English is the international language. It's a bit unfair that this is the case, but if you want your point to be made internationally, then it's really useful for it to be made by a skilled writer of native English. So I have provided a trove of material for future use, I hope.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna Bowles, for your insightful and really inspiring report. We look forward to reading more on your blog. I'll get that cup of coffee ready. And thank you once again. Wishing you the very best in the future.
Thank you, and you. Thank you for having me on.